I held the hospital forms in my trembling hands, the pen hovering over my name. The walls were white and too quiet, the air thick with antiseptic and expectation. Then my grandson's voice broke through, soft but sharp, a truth I wasn't ready to hear. Miriam, a 68-year-old widow with a gentle, weary face, has always put her family first. Her small apartment smells faintly of jasmine and old books, and the afternoons are quiet except for the occasional creak of her floorboards. Her grandson, Leo, a bright but restless 20-year-old, has been struggling with an illness that leaves him fragile and pale. Miriam's love for him is boundless, enough that she's willing to give her kidney without a second thought. But beneath the surface, subtle tensions and half-formed secrets ripple between them, waiting to surface. The hospital smelled of bleach and cold metal. I sat in the chair by the window, fingers brushing over the forms like they might bite me. The pen trembled between my hands. Outside, the sky was pale, almost gray, but the light still fell in stripes across the linoleum floor. The machines hummed softly, steady and distant. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Low, hesitant. I thought of them as whispers in a language I didn't understand. I looked down at the papers again, and for a moment, I could see a small boy sitting on the kitchen counter, legs swinging. He was laughing, chocolate smeared on his chin. I remember holding him like that, thinking I could keep him safe forever. The doctor leaned over, gentle. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Just read through these, Mrs. Thompson. We'll walk you through every step." I nodded, but the words floated around me like dust in the sunlight. I wasn't hearing them. I was hearing him, Leo, telling me he needed me. His small voice filling the living room like it had filled my heart all these years. I traced the edge of the paper with my fingertip. The forms promised sacrifice. A slice of my body given freely. My kidney. My blood. My breath in some new rhythm. I had thought I knew what love meant. But here, in the sterile quiet, it felt like a question I couldn't answer. A nurse entered, folder in hand. Her shoes made no sound on the tile, but her presence was loud. She stopped at the chair, eyes flicking down at the forms and then back to me. "Everything okay, Mrs. Thompson?" I nodded again too quickly. My throat was tight. She hesitated, just a fraction, like she knew something I didn't. The air thickened. I could feel it pressing against my chest. Why did everyone look at me like I was about to cross some invisible line? I watched her set the folder down on the counter. Papers shuffled. Pen rolled slightly. I remembered Leo, curled up on the couch after a bad day at school. His small fists balled around my hand. He had always been stubborn. Fragile, yes, but unyielding in ways that surprised me. I had thought that stubbornness would protect him from life. Now it was part of the reason he needed me. The doctor cleared his throat softly. "Take your time, Mrs. Thompson. There's no rush." But the clock on the wall ticked too loud. I could hear each second like a drumbeat inside my skull. The sunlight shifted. A shadow fell across the forms. It was me, I realized. Standing over myself. Watching. Waiting. I thought about the nights I stayed awake while he slept, counting every shallow breath, every cough, every sigh. I remembered the first time he called me in the middle of the night, voice small and scared. "Grandma, I don't feel right." I had driven across town with nothing but a flashlight and my worry. I had held him through tremors and fever and silence. Now, the paper between my fingers felt like a continuation of all those nights. The nurse's hands brushed against mine as she passed me the folder. Her eyes were soft, but full of something unspoken. "You've done so much already," she said quietly. I swallowed. My voice didn't come. I wanted to tell her it wasn't enough. It would never be enough, not for him. The hum of the machines grew louder in my chest. I focused on the fluorescent light flickering overhead. Felt like a heartbeat. And steady. Waiting. I traced the form again. Signature line. Name. Promise inked on paper. I thought about Leo's small hands gripping mine. His eyes wide with hope, with trust, with a need I couldn't refuse. The doctor bent closer again, pointing to a paragraph. Risks, Mrs. Thompson. Please make sure you understand. I nodded, still lost in memory. I could see him chasing butterflies in the garden. I could see him falling, scraping his knee, then looking up at me, smiling despite the pain. Everything I had ever done had led me to this chair, this moment. The pen hovered. My hand shook. I felt a quiet panic, a whisper in the room, the kind that says you are standing on the edge but can't see the ground. And then I thought, not of the risk, not of the surgery, not of my own body. Only of him. Of Leo, of all the years of being small, of being scared, of needing me without knowing how much I already gave. The nurse cleared her throat again. She didn't look at me, but I felt her presence like a shadow beside my chair. Shall I leave you to review this? I nodded, grateful for the silence. She smiled faintly, but not with her eyes. And then she was gone. Leaned back. The chair creaked beneath me, a familiar sound. I looked at the forms one last time. The paper was heavy, though it weighed nothing. I remembered the first time I held him in my arms after birth. His tiny fingers clung to mine. I remembered his first day of school. His first heartbreak. His first victory. Every small moment, etched in my memory like soft light. Could I give him more than a lifetime of memory? Could I give him the one thing that might let him keep living? I set the pen down beside the forms. The hum of the machines was steady now, almost soothing. Footsteps passed in the hallway again. Low, hesitant, like they were giving me space to decide. The sunlight shifted one last time, casting the papers in a warm glow. For a moment it felt like time itself had paused. I could hear Leo's laughter in my ears. I could feel his small hand in mine. And I realized that, no matter what I chose, the world would be different after this moment. Closed my eyes. And for the first time I wondered if I had truly understood what it meant to give a part of myself to another. The pen waited. The papers waited. And outside the sky was still pale, but for a moment it seemed to watch with me. The apartment smelled faintly of old wood and jasmine. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, stretching long lazy shadows across the floor. I walked slowly, my slippers making soft scuffing sounds, like the place remembered my steps. Everything was quiet, but quiet that pressed against your chest, heavy and patient. I paused in the living room. The sunlight hit the edge of the worn sofa. Dust motes floated in the streaks, catching the light like tiny fireflies. I could hear the kettle in my memory, whistling softly, though the kitchen was empty now. I remembered him, Leo, sitting at the table, hair mussed, cheeks flushed with laughter. He would reach for the mug of tea I'd poured, spilling a little onto the tablecloth, not noticing. Back then he had seemed endless. Full of energy, full of mischief, full of life I took for granted. Now the memory felt fragile. I touched the edge of the table, worn and scratched, and imagined him there again. But this time the thought made my chest tighten. The illness had crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching across the apartment, across my life. Could I really give him what he needed? Could I cross the line between motherly love and my own limits? The floorboards creaked beneath me as I moved to the hallway. The walls were pale yellow, familiar and comforting, yet today they felt closer, almost confining. I passed the small bookshelf, lined with old novels and photo frames. There he was in one of them, small hands clutching a toy car, smiling at something only he could see. The image tugged at me. Nostalgia and fear tangled in my chest. Then there was a knock. Sudden. Sharp. The sound echoed in the apartment like an alarm. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat, and my hands trembled slightly. The world outside felt loud for a moment. The faint sound of cars, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of a neighbor's television leaking through the walls. Open the door. It was Mrs. D'Souza from next door, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Delivery for you, Miriam," she said softly. Her eyes lingered on me for a second longer than usual, curious, gentle. I took the package, murmuring thanks. The ordinary act of a neighbor delivering a parcel should have been grounding. Instead, it reminded me that life outside my worry still moved, unnoticed and unstoppable. Even as shadows shifted across my floor, even as the sun dipped a little lower, the world kept turning. And here I was, caught in a quiet storm of my own making. I set the package down on the counter, made a soft thud. I watched it, oddly hypnotized by the mundane. A pen, a note, a package. Ordinary objects that carried no burden. And yet I carried everything. My love, my fear, my anticipation, the weight of a choice that would change everything. I walked to the window, looking out at the street. The leaves on the trees moved lazily in the breeze, golden light catching their edges. Children ran past, shouting, chasing the wind, unaware of the sickness that lurked quietly inside our lives. I felt a pang of envy, or maybe regret, or maybe both. How do you reconcile the ordinary world with the extraordinary choice waiting in your hands? The apartment felt cooler now. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself, the fabric soft but thin against my skin. The shadows had grown long, darker at the corners. I sat at the small kitchen table, folding my hands over each other. The wood was cold, smooth, familiar. Yet today it felt almost alien. I thought again of Leo, how he had bounced into this very kitchen years ago, all energy and laughter, spilling milk or tea, leaving tiny puddles on the floor. Back then I had worried over small cuts, scraped knees, childhood stumbles. Now I worried over a life. A life that I could save if only I could commit to the leap, if only I could face the unknown. The silence in the apartment grew heavier. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the subtle creak of the apartment settling around me. Every sound reminded me I was alone in this decision, and yet not alone at all. The weight of a tiny, fragile human rested on me, though he was upstairs in his room, perhaps resting, perhaps oblivious to the storm around him. I reached for the package again. The paper crinkled under my fingers. I thought about opening it, thinking maybe inside would be some clarity, some distraction, some ordinary reminder that life continued. But instead I paused, let it sit there, waiting, patient like me, like the shadows. A small, unshakable unease settled in my chest. It was the kind of feeling that has no sound, no shape, only presence. It whispered that I could not retreat from the choice I was facing. Could I really go through with this? Could I place a piece of myself inside another, knowing the fragility of both bodies, both hearts? I looked down at the floor. The shadows were long, leaning into each other, stretching thin across the scratches and dents in the wood. They seemed to ask the same question, silent, patient. The world outside moved on, unaware. Inside, the air was thick with waiting, with memory, with a quiet fear I could not name. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. The sunlight had softened, spilling a muted glow over the apartment. For a moment everything was still. The creaks of the floor, the scent of jasmine, the brown paper on the counter, all of it felt suspended in time. And I knew when I opened my eyes, the question would still be there. Could I give him this part of me? Could I truly step forward, past the shadows, into the unknown? The afternoon lingered like a long sigh. And outside, life went on as it always does, unaware of the quiet storm within these walls. Sunlight cut through the blinds in thin, impatient stripes. It fell across his bed in narrow lines, painting the sheets with gold and shadow. Leo was asleep. His chest rose and fell in slow, uneven rhythms. I stood in the doorway, silent, afraid to break the fragile music of the room. The quiet hummed around me, thick and heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I could smell the faint scent of laundry detergent, the faint tinge of medicine lingering in the corners. I sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb him. His hair fell across his forehead, slightly damp, messy in that way I'd always loved. I reached for his hand. He shifted slightly, barely, and I paused. There was a hesitation there, small, invisible, like a shadow resting beneath his skin. I remembered the mornings long ago, when he would tumble into the kitchen in a rush, slippers sliding across the floor, laughter spilling before his words. I had been there then, steady and patient, guiding him through scraped knees, forgotten lunches, childhood disappointments. Now I felt the weight of years, of fear, of the quiet knowledge that love alone may not be enough. I watched him, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his shoulder. Each breath was a reminder of fragility, of dependence, of all the small, quiet choices that had led us here. Could he feel how far I was willing to go for him? Did he know that I would give a part of myself without question, without hesitation, because love made me reckless? The clock ticked softly from the dresser. Each second felt louder than it should, echoing in the stillness. I wondered if he was aware of the gravity that hung in the air, the invisible thread of worry that bound me to him. He shifted again, turning slightly onto his side, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Something in that movement told me he was carrying more than his illness, a secret, a burden, a fear I could not name. I reached for his hand again. His fingers twitched, held back. I didn't want to scare him, didn't want to disturb the fragile peace he clung to in sleep. I could feel my own chest tightening, my breath shallow. There was so much I wanted to ask, so much I wanted to know, but words would shatter the quiet. I thought about the hospital forms, the weight of my choice, the life I could give him. I thought about his laughter, his stubbornness, the stubbornness that had always been his shield. And I realized, maybe there was more than illness that made him fragile. Maybe there were truths he hadn't told me. And maybe, just maybe, those truths were more dangerous than anything a body could endure. The sunlight shifted again, stretching the stripes across the room. I traced them with my eyes, imagining the path they would take as the day moved forward. Outside, life went on. Cars hummed softly down the street, neighbors called to each other across fences, birds flitted between trees. Inside, the room remained still, a suspended moment in time, holding us both in fragile balance. I leaned closer to him. The hum of the air conditioning was a quiet companion to the rhythm of his breath. I brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He flinched slightly, eyes still closed. The small gesture, so ordinary, felt like a promise, plea, an acknowledgement of all the unspoken weight that lay between us. I thought about the sacrifices I was ready to make, the part of myself I would give him without question. But I also thought about the part of him that remained hidden, locked behind a wall I could not scale. Every parent, every guardian, every person who had loved fiercely had faced this. The unknowable, the silent truth another carried within. And now it was my turn to wait, to watch, to wonder. The room felt smaller somehow. The shadows at the corners deepened, the golden stripes of sunlight retreating. I felt the pull of responsibility, the ache of impending choice, pressing on my shoulders. I wanted to ask, wanted to demand, wanted to know everything. But I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. I brushed my hand along his blanket again. The fabric was soft, warm with his presence. I wanted to hold him, to shield him, to carry him like I used to carry a child who fell too often. But I only stayed watching, listening, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones. And then I noticed it. The faint twitch of his fingers, the slight furrow in his brow, the subtle tension in his shoulders. He was holding something back. Something small, something silent but heavy. My chest constricted. I wanted to pry, to pull the secret into the open, but the room demanded patience. The hum of air, the soft tick of the clock, the gentle rhythm of his breath, these were the only witnesses. I thought of all the mornings, afternoons, and nights that had led us here. The scraped knees, the sleepless nights, the whispered promises in the dark. I had loved him with all my heart, and I had feared for him every step of the way. But now I realized the truth. Love alone could not illuminate what he hid. And maybe it was time to let the silence speak, to wait for him to trust me with it. The light shifted again. Golden stripes softened into pale warmth. I leaned back, letting the weight of the quiet press against me. I could feel the unspoken question hovering between us. What is he keeping from me? And I knew somehow the answer would come, but only when he was ready. I left the room slowly. The floorboards whispered beneath my feet. The door closed softly behind me, leaving the room filled with his small, steady breath. The weight of silence lingered, heavy but gentle, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Outside, the sunlight continued its slow march across the apartment. Inside I waited. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I understood that love sometimes meant patience, even when the heart ached with fear. The floorboards creaked softly as I knelt by the edge of Leo's bed. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, dust motes dancing lazily in the thin stripes. I reached under instinctively, and my fingers brushed against the familiar texture of an old worn photo album. It was tucked in the corner, almost hidden, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The leather was cracked and soft, smelling faintly of time and memory. I pulled it out slowly, cradling it in my hands like something fragile, almost sacred. Opened it. Pages thick with yellowed edges and corners curling from age. Pictures of him as a child filled the pages. Messy hair, scraped knees, laughter frozen in silver tones. Christmas mornings with tangled ribbons, faces pressed against tree ornaments. I smiled quietly, a soft ache in my chest. He had been so small, so alive, so unaware of the fragility that would come later. I traced a finger over a photo of him clutching a toy car, hair mussed, eyes wide with wonder. A memory surfaced, the sound of his giggle in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread baking, my hand always near to steady him. But then I saw it. A photograph tucked between the pages, one that didn't fit with the rest. Leo standing in a garden, but his expression was unfamiliar. Tight, wary, almost adult. Next to him, a boy I didn't recognize, taller, shadowed in the background. The sunlight in the picture seemed different, harsher, colder than the warmth of the other photos. My heart tightened. I had never seen this child, never heard his name, never known this day had existed. I lingered over the image, tracing the lines of Leo's face, searching for the boy I knew in the shadows of the photograph. Memories and half-memories stirred uncomfortably. I thought of days he had told me about, stories blurred with laughter or embarrassment. But this day, it was missing. Absent. A gap in the narrative I thought I had known so well. Closed my eyes. The photo pressed against my chest. Could a past I never knew explain the unease that had been settling over me for weeks? Could this silent fragment, hidden and forgotten, hold the answer to the questions I hadn't dared to ask? I turned the page slowly, as if moving too fast would shatter the fragile reality of the past. Other pictures followed. Birthday cakes, playgrounds, messy paint-covered hands. Normal life, ordinary and warm. Yet the image lingered at the back of my mind like a shadow refusing to leave. I flipped back again. My eyes traced the faces, the angles of the garden, the stranger beside him. Who was he? What had happened that day? And why had Leo never mentioned it? The apartment seemed to shrink around me. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than it should. I could hear the distant chatter of neighbors outside, muffled and distant, like a world moving forward without me. I hugged the album closer, feeling the weight of years of stories untold, pressing against my chest. I thought of all the nights I had watched him sleep, all the whispered promises in the dark. And now I wondered what I had never known. I sat back on my heels, resting the album on my lap. Sunlight shifted across the floor, the dust motes scattering like small memories of their own. I thought about Leo's stubbornness, the quiet way he carried himself, the way he had always shielded his fears. Perhaps some of that fear came from this day, this fragment I had never seen. I wondered what he had felt standing there in the garden, what he had held back from me all these years. The thought made my stomach twist softly, quietly. I traced the edges of the photograph again. The boy beside him remained shadowed, faceless in my memory now. I imagined a story for him, small fragments filling the gaps. A playmate, a rival, someone lost to time. But the more I imagined, the more I realized I would never know from conjecture alone. The photograph had power only because it was silent. It asked questions but offered no answers. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the edge of the album. The leather smelled faintly of old wood and rain, comforting and strange all at once. I wanted to ask Leo about the boy, about that day, about the memory he had never shared. But I hesitated. Love, I realized, sometimes meant waiting for someone to reveal themselves in their own time. I could not force him, could not demand the past from him. I could only hold the fragments, and hope they would fit together one day. The light shifted again. Golden and soft, it spilled over the pages, illuminating the photograph in a way that made it seem alive. I lingered over it, letting the image press against my heart. I remembered his laughter, his stubbornness, the way he had always clung to life with a small, defiant energy. And I realized that even in the shadows of the unknown, he was still my grandson, still here, still waiting for me to understand. I closed the album gently. The leather cracked softly beneath my hands. I set it back under the bed, where it belonged, silent but present. The weight of the fragment lingered in my chest. Did not scare me. Not entirely. But it reminded me that there were stories yet untold, truths hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. I stood slowly. The sunlight fell across the floor in long, patient stripes. The dust motes floated lazily, indifferent to the ache in my heart. I realized that understanding, like light, moves slowly. And sometimes, the past only reveals itself in fragments. I left the room quietly. The floorboards whispered beneath my slippers. The photograph remained tucked beneath the bed, holding its secret. And I wondered, as I walked through the apartment, if one day he would tell me what it meant. Until then, the fragment waited. And I waited with it. The doorbell rang once, sharply, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I had been sitting by the window, watching the afternoon light pool across the kitchen floor. Startled me. My heart leapt, small and insistent. The apartment felt suddenly too big, too empty, the hum of the refrigerator sounding louder than usual. I set the teacup down with a soft clink, the sound echoing more than it should, and rose to answer. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there. A distant cousin I hadn't seen in years, shoulders tight, eyes shifting as if the floor might tell secrets if he looked too long. In his hands was a small stack of envelopes, tied together with fraying string, worn and yellowed. "Mrs. Thompson." "Miriam," he said, his voice hesitant. I nodded, inviting him inside. The apartment seemed smaller now, the walls leaning in with expectation. We sat in the living room. He placed the letters on the table, brushing his fingers over them like they were too fragile to touch. I glanced at the handwriting, childish, familiar, yet strangely foreign in the jagged loops of early writing. I reached for one, and he stopped me with a gentle, nervous hand. "Wait, you might want to read them in order," he said softly, eyes fixed somewhere behind me, not quite meeting mine. The room felt thick, the light falling in stripes across the carpet, dust motes drifting in lazy arcs. He cleared his throat, finally looking at me. "Leo, he was different back then," he said, voice low, as if saying it too loud would break something. I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. His eyes darted, avoiding mine, and I realized he was holding back, something beneath the surface that refused to speak. The hum of the city outside became distant, muffled, like we were suspended in our own quiet world. I picked up a letter, careful, trembling slightly. The paper smelled faintly of old ink and childhood summers, of memories pressed into fragile folds. He watched me, shifting his weight, fingers twisting the edge of his sleeve. "Leo, he had medical issues. When he was little," he said, each word fragmented, cautious. I frowned, my stomach tightening. Something was not being said. The letters lay on the table, silent witnesses to a past I had never known. What had I misunderstood about the life he had been leading quietly? I opened the first envelope slowly. Inside were scribbles and childish drawings, notes from the pediatrician, reminders, small records of fever, medication, follow-ups. I traced them with my finger, absorbing the minutiae of his early struggles. The cousin watched, silent, eyes narrowing slightly as if he feared I would see too much. You never knew, did you?" he asked, voice almost breaking. I shook my head, throat tight, heart tightening in rhythm with the words I hadn't known to ask. He leaned back, his gaze finally meeting mine, fleeting but charged. The doctors, they were cautious. He always tried to hide it. From everyone, he said, almost whispering, as if the apartment could carry his confession. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The unease I had carried for weeks now settled like stone in my chest. There were truths, quiet and invisible, layered beneath the boy I had watched grow. And I had missed them. All of them. I ran my fingers over another envelope. Inside were sketches of hospital rooms, scribbled notes about medications, small diagrams of the body. He had been documenting it himself, even as a child. A boy hiding pieces of himself, recording fragments of his life, keeping them close. I felt a wave of sorrow, for the fear, for the secrecy, for the weight he bore silently. How much had he carried alone? And how long had I misunderstood his quiet resilience for ordinary stubbornness? The cousin shifted again, fidgeting with his jacket. "You should know, there's more," he said softly, almost apologetically. I waited, heart hammering, ears straining for the words he wouldn't fully say. The letters between us felt like a bridge, and yet he was holding part of it back, a shadow in the gaps of paper. I realized I had been blind to parts of him, parts he had hidden even from me, for love or for survival. I traced the handwriting, a mixture of childish scrawl and careful notation. Each line spoke of small victories and hidden fears. Fever measured in the night. Medicine administered in silence. Bruises he never mentioned. A life I had partially known, yet only now seeing its texture, its weight. I looked up, expecting answers from my cousin, but he avoided my eyes, hands clenched on his knees. What was he keeping from me? What truth had not been written, not been shared, but shaped the boy I loved anyway? The room felt smaller. Shadows pooled beneath the table, stretching toward us like silent fingers. I realized then that understanding is not always a gift freely given. Sometimes it is something we uncover slowly, painfully, with pieces that don't quite fit together. The letters lay there, fragments of a past I had never been allowed to see, and yet they were only part of the story. I breathed slowly, letting the weight settle in my chest. The cousin's eyes flicked toward the window, at the dust motes drifting through the shafts of sunlight. I realized he was nervous, not for himself, but for the story that would finally meet the one person who mattered most. A story of sickness, of hidden fear, of resilience and quiet survival. I wanted to ask everything, but I stayed quiet. Patience, I reminded myself. Some truths need to reveal themselves in their own time. I set the first envelope aside, careful not to smudge the ink. The apartment hummed softly, shadows stretching and retreating with the fading light. The cousin shifted again, small sounds of unease echoing softly across the wooden floor. I understood, something was hidden just beyond the reach of the letters. A part of Leo's life I had yet to know, shaping him silently, invisibly. I leaned back, letting the room breathe around me. The sunlight softened, golden and patient, falling across the stack of letters. I felt the weight of everything, the love, the worry, the small, hidden struggles, pressing gently against my heart. And I knew, in that quiet, that my understanding of him had been incomplete. But the questions would remain, suspended in the air like dust motes, waiting for the moment he chose to answer. The cousin rose to leave. He left the letters on the table, still tied with fraying string, silent witnesses to a life carefully recorded. I watched him go, footsteps soft but urgent, retreating into the hallway. The door closed behind him with a faint click. The apartment settled back into quiet, heavier now, filled with invisible tension and whispered truths. I sat for a long moment, staring at the letters. The shadows deepened, the light softened, and I realized that love is never simple. It is patient, it is heavy, and sometimes it waits for truths we are not yet ready to hear. The apartment was quiet but not empty. Streetlights spilled through the curtains in long lazy bars of orange, painting the walls with soft shadows. I sat at the small kitchen table, the hospital forms spread before me like fragile wings. My hands trembled slightly as I traced the lines of ink, signatures, boxes waiting to be checked. Outside, a car rolled past slowly, its tires whispering against wet asphalt. Inside, I felt the weight of what I was about to do pressing against my chest. A whisper of doubt had crept in, subtle and insistent, threading itself between my breaths. I reread the forms for the third time. Each line felt heavier than the last. My eyes lingered on the words. Consent, risk, recovery, irreversible. I had known in theory what I was signing up for. But theory does not account for the quiet terror of real life. I thought about Leo. Fragile, stubborn in a way only children can be. And now grown into a young man whose life rested quietly, invisibly, on choices I had to make. Could I fully understand what it meant to give him a part of myself? Could I understand the weight of his trust? The apartment creaked around me. The floorboards whispered under my shifting weight. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, low and steady, and the distant tick of the wall clock. Everything seemed magnified in the silence. The slow drip of a faucet in the bathroom, the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. Doubt lingered at the edges of my thoughts, small and persistent, whispering that maybe, just maybe, I didn't know everything I needed to know about him, about his past, about the quiet burdens he had carried alone. A soft knock at the bedroom door startled me. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. Leo entered slowly, his expression careful, tentative, as if every movement was weighed before being made. In his hand he held a small note. Folded neatly, edges sharp, creases deliberate. It was a silent thing, speaking without sound. He lingered in the doorway, eyes searching mine, waiting, measuring. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, loud against the quiet of the room. He came closer, holding the note out between us. I took it, fingers brushing his, the contact electric in its simplicity. He didn't speak, not yet. The note was folded in thirds, small and deliberate, a quiet plea tucked into paper. I traced the lines with my fingers, careful not to unfold it too quickly. There was something in the weight of it, the careful way it had been folded, the smallness of it, the courage it must have taken him to leave it here for me. I unfolded the paper slowly. His handwriting was small, deliberate, neat in a way that belied the tremor I imagined in his hand as he wrote it. Each word carried quiet honesty, a soft rhythm I could feel more than read. It spoke of fears he had not voiced, of questions he had not asked aloud. It spoke of love, of trust, of vulnerability wrapped in silence. And it made the doubt inside me flare brighter, whispering that perhaps there was more I didn't yet understand about the life he had been living quietly, beneath my notice. I looked up at him and he finally met my gaze. His eyes were wide, uncertain, shadowed by something I had never seen before. Fear I could not name. He smiled faintly but not fully, not with his eyes. The note trembled slightly in my hands, and I realized that it was not just a message. It was an invitation, an offering, a truth he was ready to share, but only if I could receive it gently, without judgment, without the urgency of panic or fear. I sat back in my chair, holding the note close. The streetlight cast long, patient shadows across the floor. I felt the weight of silence settle around us, thick and quiet, comforting and pressing all at once. Doubt whispered still, subtle and unrelenting, but now there was a counterpoint. A fragile, bright thread of trust, fragile but undeniable. He had chosen to give me this, to open a window into a part of himself that had been hidden. And that was enough for now. I read the note again, slowly, savoring each word. There was no shouting, no demand, no accusation. Just truth, folded carefully, wrapped in the small courage of a boy grown into a man, who had learned to hide his fear behind restraint. It made the tremor in my hands feel lighter somehow, like a thread had been tied between us, delicate but strong. I could feel the quiet insistence of the paper in my hands, urging me to understand, to wait, to let the story unfold. He sat across from me, still silent, watching the orange glow of the streetlights ripple across the floor. The note lay between us, a fragile bridge. I realized then that love is patient, yes, but it is also full of quiet vigilance, waiting for the right moment, for trust to be given, for silence to speak in its own time. I folded the note again, carefully, preserving the intention of the giver. And in that act, I felt the tiniest lift in my chest, a whisper of hope threading through the doubt. We stayed like that for a while, in the glow of the streetlights. The apartment hummed softly, alive with small, gentle sounds. The distant car, the occasional footstep outside, the slow breath of the man across from me. I realized that the note, though small, carried more than words. It carried honesty, vulnerability, a plea to understand without fear. And I understood in that quiet that whatever came next, we would face it together. Finally he stood, tucking his hands behind his back. I watched him pause in the doorway, the soft orange light catching the edges of his face. He didn't speak, but his eyes said enough. Trust me, he seemed to say. I nodded, and he left the room silently. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I sat alone again, the apartment bathed in the warm, patient glow of streetlights. The note rested on the table, fragile and full of meaning. I felt the whisper of doubt linger still, but it was quieter now, tempered by the truth I had received. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet fill me, and realized that sometimes the courage to act comes not from certainty, but from a small, fragile understanding given in silence. And tonight that understanding had arrived, folded neatly in paper and trust. The streetlights shifted slowly across the walls. I closed my eyes, letting the weight settle, letting the quiet teach me what patience and love could bear. Tomorrow would come with questions, with choices. But tonight, there was only the soft hum of the apartment, the whispered doubt, and the fragile truth resting between us. The kitchen smelled of tea and quiet evening. Steam rose from the kettle in thin, curling tendrils, catching the light from the lamp above. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around my cup, feeling the warmth seep slowly into my fingers. Outside, the city hummed softly, distant cars rolling past, muffled voices drifting through the walls. Everything seemed ordinary, but the tension in the air felt almost tangible. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady but anxious, a metronome counting down to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. He stood by the counter, shifting slightly, avoiding my gaze. Leo. My grandson. My boy. My worry made flesh. He fiddled with the edge of a dish towel, twisting it between his hands. Finally he spoke. Grandma, I need to tell you something. His voice was hesitant, almost fragile, but steady enough to command the room. I nodded, waiting, sensing that this was more than a casual confession. The kettle hissed quietly, boiling just beneath the rim, and the faint tick of the wall clock marked each pause, each weighted breath between us. I felt my chest tighten, a small, persistent ache growing as I braced for what I might hear. He took a deep breath, and I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands refused to rest flat against the counter. I made a choice, he said softly. The words hung between us, fragile and deliberate. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just listened. About my illness, about the treatments, he continued. His voice wavered, but he steadied himself with each word. I felt a flicker of unease, a whisper in my chest. Had I misunderstood something all along? My hands gripped the cup tighter, knuckles white, steam fogging my glasses. I didn't tell anyone at first, he admitted, eyes finally meeting mine for a fraction of a second. I wanted to protect you. And maybe myself. I swallowed, the weight of his words settling slowly over me. The kitchen seemed smaller now, the shadows from the cabinets stretching long across the tile floor. I traced the rim of my cup with a finger, grounding myself in the simple warmth of tea while absorbing what he had said. He had made a choice I hadn't known, a choice that shifted everything I believed about the situation. He stepped closer, hands clasped loosely in front of him. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to rush into something for me without knowing everything, he said quietly. The confession hung between us, delicate and sharp, like glass catching the lamplight. I felt a wave of shock, relief, and sorrow mingle in my chest. All at once, the enormity of my decision, the one looming over me like a shadow, became painfully clear. I set the cup down, the clink loud in the quiet room. His eyes searched mine, waiting, tentative, afraid of the reaction he might see reflected back. Could you forgive me for not telling you sooner?" he asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I just nodded, letting the silence speak for both of us. The faint hiss of the kettle and the tick of the clock filled the space between words, punctuating the confession in a rhythm almost musical. I breathed slowly, letting the shock wash through me. The truth he revealed was not simple. It carried layers, of fear, of protection, of a quiet bravery I had never fully recognized. I felt the world tilt slightly beneath my feet, the room tilting with it, familiar shapes now tinged with new meaning. Could I have acted without knowing this? I shivered, the question pressing against my ribs like an invisible hand. He looked down, running a hand through his hair, the motion almost absent-minded but charged with tension. "I wanted you to make your choice knowing the real, everything," he said softly. The words were heavy, deliberate, full of quiet weight. I felt a surge of love, fierce and delicate, threaded through my chest. I had always known him as my grandson, as the boy who laughed too loudly, who stubbornly scraped knees and hid fears behind stubborn smiles. But this was something else. I reached across the table, my hand hovering over his. He didn't move at first. Then slowly he allowed our fingers to touch. The warmth of him was grounding, familiar, and yet new in its intensity. His confession, delivered with careful restraint, had opened a window I hadn't known existed. I could see him differently now, not just as the boy I had watched grow, but as someone who had carried hidden burdens silently, choosing courage in his own way. We sat in silence, hands brushing lightly, the room filled with ordinary sounds rendered extraordinary by the weight of what had been shared. The tea kettle hissed, steam curling like gentle smoke into the quiet light. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they didn't fall. Not yet. I simply breathed, listening to the rhythm of his steady presence, the faint tick of the clock marking the passage of this delicate, life-changing moment. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he whispered again, soft as a leaf falling. And in that small apology, I felt both the depth of his love and the burden he had borne alone. I realized that the decision I faced, the one about giving a part of myself, was no longer just mine. It was shared, threaded with his courage, his hidden fears, and the quiet truth he had finally entrusted to me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle, letting the enormity of what had been revealed wash over me. The shadows shifted in the lamplight, long and patient across the floor. I felt the weight of the choice, and the relief of understanding, mingling in a bittersweet ache. Could I have acted without knowing this? I shivered again, softly, letting the warmth of his hand anchor me. The kettle clicked, the water boiled and hissed, but I didn't move immediately. I simply sat there, absorbing, breathing, letting the quiet teach me what patience and love could bear. He remained across the table, silent but present, watching me with tentative trust. And I understood, in the gentle rhythm of shared space and whispered truths, that love is never simple. It is quiet, it is patient, and it is heavy with choices we do not make alone. And tonight, in the soft light of the kitchen, with the scent of tea and the tick of the clock, I felt the enormity of what was coming, tempered now with understanding, tempered with shared truth. The evening outside deepened. Shadows pooled, soft and patient. I held his gaze for a long moment, letting the weight of what had been shared settle between us. Tomorrow would demand decisions, and the consequences of what I was about to do would ripple through both our lives. But tonight, there was only the soft hum of the kitchen, the whispered confession, and the fragile, steadfast bond of trust. I stepped out onto the balcony, the evening air cool against my skin. The city stretched below me, distant lights flickering like quiet fireflies. Car engines hummed softly far away, muffled by the height and the distance. I leaned against the railing, letting the metal chill seep into my palms, grounding me. The sky above was a deep indigo, streaked with the last remnants of fading sun. Everything felt slowed, hushed, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting. And in that stillness, my thoughts began to swirl, untangling themselves in whispers. I thought about Leo, curled up on the couch, the small note tucked carefully on the kitchen table. His confession lingered like smoke in the air, delicate, persistent, unspoken after the words had fallen. I remembered the first time I had held him as a child, the weight of his tiny body against mine, fragile and stubborn all at once. And now, years later, I held the weight of a different kind of fragility in my hands, the knowledge of his secret, the reality of what I was about to offer him, and the quiet, relentless pull of love that refused to let me step back. The wind stirred my hair, carrying the faint scent of rain and city streets, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle around me. I remembered other moments of clarity, small, sudden illuminations in the midst of ordinary days. Times when intuition had whispered, soft and insistent, guiding my hands, guiding my choices. And now it whispered again, a gentle urging that told me, pay attention, notice the quiet truths, trust what you feel even when it frightens you. The shadows of doubt clung to me still, stretching long and patient in the corner of my mind. But beneath them, there was a glimmer of something else. Subtle, steady light. A hint of understanding. A path forward that I had not yet dared to see clearly. I inhaled slowly, the cool air filling my lungs, carrying away some of the weight of the night. The distant hum of the city became a lullaby, steady and comforting, while my own heartbeat echoed softly in my chest. I traced my fingers along the balcony railing, feeling the rough texture of peeling paint beneath my fingertips. It reminded me of resilience, of things that had weathered storms and continued, quietly, to hold their shape. I thought about love and sacrifice, two forces that were never easy to reconcile, and yet somehow I had been asked to balance them both in a single, impossible choice. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's balcony. I closed my eyes and let the fragrance mingle with my thoughts. Leo's secret had tilted my world, made the familiar unfamiliar. I realized that everything I believed about protecting him, about guiding him, had been incomplete. But knowing now, even in fragments, allowed me to see the subtle contours of truth, where fear and courage intertwined, where love and responsibility met. Could I reconcile what I felt with what I needed to do? Could I hold the weight of his truth without letting it break me? I watched the city lights flicker below, the small windows glowing with lives that carried their own quiet stories. I imagined countless choices being made behind those windows, small sacrifices, unspoken words, gentle acts of care. And I understood that what I faced was not unique, only sharpened by love, sharpened by the fragility of a life I held dear. I felt a subtle warmth rise in my chest, threading through the doubt, winding around my ribcage like a lifeline. It was not certainty, not fully, but it was enough to begin walking forward. A pigeon landed on the balcony railing, ruffling its feathers, and I watched it tilt its head, considering me, considering the world. Its calm, small presence reminded me that even in the midst of confusion and fear, life continued. I had been given a choice, and with that choice came responsibility. For love, for honesty, for the quiet, steady protection of someone whose world had always been partially hidden from me. I let the silence settle again, feeling the gentle pull of the night, the stretch of shadows and the light bleeding through them. It was a reminder that life is always a mixture of both, intertwined in ways we rarely see until we step back. I thought of Leo, of the bravery hidden in his note, in his hesitation, in the way he had finally trusted me with the truth. I imagined the moment I would hold him in my arms again, offering not just part of myself, but the reassurance that love is patient, and understanding can survive even the heaviest shadows. The cool air brushed against my cheek, and I felt the first tremor of resolve settling quietly in my chest. It was not loud or forceful. It was patient, deliberate, steady. A quiet acknowledgement that I could face the choice before me with eyes wide open, heart aware, and hands ready to hold both fear and hope. I took a final, long breath, letting the city hum around me, letting the shadows stretch and fade into light. The night seemed to pulse softly with possibility, each flicker of light a reminder that decisions could be heavy, but they could also illuminate a path. I straightened, pressing my hands against the railing, feeling the chill and warmth at once. Love, sacrifice, truth, shadows, light. They coexisted, threaded together, and I felt ready, or as ready as anyone could be, to navigate them. I turned back toward the apartment, the warmth inside waiting, the faint scent of tea still clinging to the air. The note, the confession, the whispered truths, they were waiting for me too, patient in their quiet insistence. The night outside had done its work. Shadows had clarified, light had threaded through the gaps, and I felt, finally, that I could take the next step. My heart was heavy, yes, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, I found the courage to face what tomorrow would bring. The balcony door clicked softly behind me. Shadows stretched long across the floor as I stepped into the warm lamplight. I could feel the weight of understanding in my chest, pressing gently, insistently. And I knew that the path forward was not simple, not certain, but it was illuminated enough to walk. The night whispered quietly, and I listened. The hospital door slid open with a soft whoosh, and I stepped into the corridor, my bag heavy at my side. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a white hum that blended with the shuffle of feet and distant murmurs. Families passed me, each carrying their own weight. A father rubbing his temples, a mother clutching a folder like a talisman, a child dragging a small suitcase, hopeful and uncertain. I watched them without looking too closely, letting their stories brush against mine without touching. My own steps echoed lightly on the polished floor, each one measured, careful, deliberate. The bag at my side carried more than papers. It carried hope, fear, and the fragile trust of someone I loved beyond words. And with every step, the gravity of my choice pressed against my chest. I paused near a window that looked out over the parking lot, the late morning sun striking the glass at an angle that painted golden lines across the floor. I could see cars crawling past, patients arriving, ambulances idling, lives moving forward despite everything. I breathed slowly, letting the warmth of the sun thread through my sleeves, letting the quiet reach inside me. Leo's words from the night before hovered in my mind, repeating softly, "I wanted you to make your choice knowing the real, everything." I remembered the way his hands trembled, the slight shift of his shoulders, the vulnerability he had finally allowed me to witness. I felt the weight of that vulnerability now, settling heavily on my own heart. I found a bench near the nurse's station and sat down, the smooth plastic cool beneath my fingers. The forms rested on my lap, crisp and unassuming, but heavy with consequences. I flipped through them absent-mindedly, my eyes skimming over lines and checkboxes, signatures and instructions, as if reading the words aloud could somehow give me guidance. But the guidance had already come, quiet and insistent, threaded through Leo's confession and the memory of every small moment we had shared. Scraped knees, whispered laughter, nights sitting by his bed listening to his breath. I closed my eyes and let those memories press against me, shaping the contours of what I knew I had to do. The sound of hurried footsteps drew me back, a family passing, voices low and tense, carrying worry and hope in equal measure. I noticed the mother squeeze her child's hand, fingers tight around small knuckles, and I felt the same instinct, to hold on, to protect, to give everything. But protection could not erase choice. I felt the bag at my side again, the paper weight of decision pressing against my thigh, reminding me that love was not just sentiment. It was action. It was courage. It was knowing when to risk everything for the sake of someone else. I stood again, walking slowly toward the elevators. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured, the corridor stretching long and quiet before me. I passed the hospital rooms, glimpsing windows that held pale curtains and hushed whispers, lives suspended in moments of uncertainty. I remembered Leo as a boy, hiding in the corner with a book, laughing softly at a joke I hadn't understood, small and stubborn and alive. Now he was still small in my mind, still fragile in ways I could never fully explain, and yet stronger than I had ever given him credit for. He had trusted me with the truth, a truth that could have broken me if I had not been ready to listen. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped inside, the smell of antiseptic mixing with a faint metallic tang of machinery. I pressed the button for the surgery floor, and the ascent felt like a slow climb through layers of thought. I pictured Leo waiting, perhaps nervous, perhaps unaware of the storm swirling in my chest. The walls of the elevator closed around me, and in that confined quiet, I felt the weight of responsibility settle fully, pressing at my lungs, urging my heart to steady. It was a weight I welcomed, and one I feared all at once. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched before me, brighter and quieter than the floors below. The nurse's station glimmered under the artificial light, a quiet sentinel of routine and procedure. I passed rooms with white curtains drawn, the faint sounds of monitors beeping, patients breathing, life continuing in measured rhythms. And I realized fully the gravity of the choice in my hands. This was not just about a kidney. It was about trust, about the bond between us, about honoring both the truth Leo had shared and the love that had guided me every step of the way. I stopped near a window again, sunlight spilling in and highlighting the slight tremor in my hands. I could feel the heat of it, the pull of decision threading through my fingers, through my chest, through the very air I breathed. I thought of all the small sacrifices I had made in my life, and all the ones I was ready to make now. The full weight of trust settled on me, heavy but steady, a tangible thing I could almost hold in my palms. Could I give part of myself to honor him, to honor what he had finally allowed me to know? I took the forms from my bag, spreading them out on a small counter by the nurse's station. The paper was crisp, white, and unyielding, a quiet, formal weight to hold against the storm of emotion inside me. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, feeling the pen press against the paper like a heartbeat made visible. With each line, I felt both the tremor of fear and the steadiness of resolve. The choice was mine, but it was threaded through his trust, his confession, his quiet bravery. I folded the forms carefully, sliding them back into the envelope with reverence. The corridor seemed softer now, warmer, the distant voices of families and nurses blending into a gentle hum. I could feel the pull of love and responsibility coiling around my heart, steady and strong. I knew the path I had chosen, not without fear, not without uncertainty, but clear in its devotion. And for the first time fully I felt the weight of it balanced by the light of understanding. I stepped toward the nurse who would take the forms, my hand extended, the envelope pressed to my chest. The decision was made. Not lightly, not easily, but with every thread of my being aligned toward truth and care. The future was unknown, yes, but I felt ready, or as ready as one could ever be, to face it with him, with love, and with the fragile, unbreakable bond that had guided me here. The nurse accepted the forms with a quiet nod. I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest, replaced by a calm determination that pulsed softly through my veins. I took a deep breath, letting it fill me, steady and deliberate. The corridor stretched ahead, a path bathed in both shadows and light, and I walked forward knowing that love had led me true. The garden was quiet, almost hesitant in its peace. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hospital lawn, soft and golden, brushing the edges of leaves and the worn benches. I walked slowly along the gravel path, feeling the crunch beneath my shoes, each step measured. The faint hum of distant voices and the occasional beep of a machine inside the hospital were softened by the walls and trees. The breeze carried a hint of jasmine from a nearby planter, a fragrance that seemed to fold itself around memory, comfort, and longing all at once. Leo was already there, seated on a wooden bench, his figure small against the broadness of the garden. He didn't look up immediately, and I didn't rush him. I let the quiet speak first. I settled beside him, careful not to startle him, the space between us neither too close nor too distant. The sunlight warmed my shoulders, and I felt the faint tremor of nerves through my chest. All those days of worry, all those nights replaying his words and confessions, seemed to condense into this single moment. The air held a delicate tension, not loud or sharp, but persistent, pressing gently against my awareness. I noticed the way his hands rested loosely in his lap, fingers brushing the edge of the bench, tentative and searching. And for the first time, the weight of what had passed, and what was yet to be shared, seemed fully tangible, pressing softly, insistently into my chest. I cleared my throat quietly and said nothing at first, letting the garden breathe between us. Leo glanced at me, eyes careful, unblinking, but softened by a trace of trust. I wasn't sure how to tell you," he said finally, voice low, hesitant, almost a whisper. I turned slightly, giving him space, letting him guide the rhythm of what we would share. The breeze carried the faint rustle of leaves, and I noticed the way sunlight flickered across his hair, illuminating strands I had watched grow for years. I reached out slowly, letting my hand hover for a moment above his, uncertain if he would retreat or receive it. When our fingers touched, it was brief, almost a brush, but enough. A small bridge between two hearts heavy with unspoken truths. "I didn't want to worry you," he murmured, the words fragile but firm. "I know," I replied softly, letting the warmth of his hand settle into mine, letting the silence carry as much meaning as the words. We spoke then, gently, almost in whispers, threading our conversation through fears and confessions, mistakes and hidden truths. I could feel the weight of each word, the tremor of vulnerability, the cautious trust in the spaces between sentences. The sunlight shifted, brushing his cheek as he spoke of moments he had never shared, moments that had shaped him quietly, painfully. I listened, letting the rhythm of his voice guide my attention, noticing the slight catch when he mentioned choices he regretted, and the subtle lift when he spoke of resilience. We didn't fill the air with reassurances or platitudes. There was no need. The garden held it for us, the jasmine, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of life continuing. I felt my chest loosen slightly, the tension of fear and uncertainty easing into something quieter, steadier. It was a careful unfolding, like the petals of a flower revealing themselves slowly to the sun. We spoke of forgiveness too, though neither of us named it outright. It was in the touch of hands, the nod of understanding, the quiet acknowledgement that mistakes and silence had shaped us, but had not broken the bond that held us together. I noticed the warmth of his shoulder against mine as we shifted slightly, leaning toward a shared space of comfort. The bench beneath us felt solid, supportive, a grounding for the tentative reconnection taking place above it. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake, imagining the unspoken fears lodged in his chest, and now here we were, letting them surface gently, letting them be heard without judgment. The air smelled faintly of jasmine again, a delicate reminder that beauty and calm could exist alongside uncertainty. Leo's voice was steadier now, the tremor replaced by a quiet certainty. "I'm glad you stayed," he said softly, and I felt the gravity of those words, the gratitude woven between them. I smiled, but quietly, letting the gesture linger in the soft light rather than force itself into drama. "I never left," I whispered, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to carry the weight of years, of love, of trust, of all the small, silent sacrifices we had made for each other. We watched a bird hop along the gravel path, pecking at scattered seeds. It moved without fear, without hesitation, and I felt a subtle lesson in its calm, careful persistence. Life, fragile and unpredictable, continued, carrying with it both beauty and risk. Our hands stayed intertwined for a long moment, and I realized the quiet power of touch, how it could bridge gaps that words sometimes could not reach. We spoke then of the future, not in grand promises, but in small truths: patience, care, honesty, and presence. I felt the ache of fear mingle with a faint, steady warmth of hope. The sun sank lower, casting long stripes of shadow across the garden, and I watched the light catch his eyes, reflecting something tender, something reconciled. We didn't need more than that, more than the silent acknowledgement that we were both here, fully present, fully known. The hospital walls behind us seemed less confining now, the distant beeps and hums fading into the background, replaced by a quiet, shared rhythm. I could feel the gaps of silence, of unspoken truths, softening, not erased, but reconciled in this shared presence. Finally I stood, brushing gravel from my skirt, and he rose beside me. Our hands lingered together a moment longer, a quiet contract of trust and understanding. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of jasmine, a reminder of continuity, of life gently threading itself through uncertainty and fear. We walked slowly back toward the hospital doors, shadows stretching long behind us, light guiding each step forward. The past lingered, yes, but it no longer weighed unbearably on our hearts. And in that quiet reconciliation, I felt the promise of love and honesty, strong enough to carry us into whatever awaited beyond these walls. The garden faded behind us, but the warmth remained, a quiet assurance that even in the midst of fear, even in the shadow of unspoken truths, connection and understanding could endure. And as we stepped into the corridor, I knew that the fragile, tender bridge we had built today would hold us steady, no matter what tomorrow might bring. The morning light came slow, brushing through the hospital blinds in soft, golden lines. The walls were pale, washed in quiet illumination that made the room feel larger, calmer. I stood for a moment at the edge of the bed, my hands folded, feeling the cool rhythm of my own breath. Leo slept, the fragile rise and fall of his chest steady, serene, a hint of a smile lingering on his lips. No alarms, no sudden news, no frantic decisions. Just the gentle insistence of daylight, pouring over him, over me, over all that had passed. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and warmth, clean and ordinary, yet heavy with meaning. It was here, in the hush of morning, that the weight of all the choices I had carried, forms in my bag, confessions, secrets, fears, finally settled. I moved closer, careful not to disturb him, my fingers brushing over the edge of the blanket. The world outside the window hummed quietly, distant voices and faint traffic muffled by thick hospital walls. For a long moment, I simply watched him, thinking of every scraped knee, every tear, every laugh we had shared across his years. The memory of his confessions, of our long conversations in shadows and sunlight, replayed in gentle fragments in my mind. The uncertainty that had pressed on my chest for days softened here, in the glow of early light. I realized the mystery of his secret, once a weight, was now a bridge, connecting hearts that had been honest only in fragments until now. A grounding warmth spread through me, quiet but unshakable, a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I sat down at the edge of the bed, careful not to startle him, feeling the texture of the sheet beneath my fingers. There was no rush, no need to speak. The morning moved with its own gentle cadence, a rhythm of light, air, and quiet understanding. My hands held the hospital forms for a moment, heavy with decision. I breathed in slowly, letting the gravity of it settle, and let it go in silence. This wasn't about courage or heroics. It was about love, about truth, about being fully present for someone who had trusted me with his fears and joys alike. I remembered the note he had left, the confession he had shared, the small touches that had bridged the space between us. All of it led here, to this quiet room, to this fragile smile on his sleeping face. I felt the pulse of connection, steady and enduring, like the faint rhythm of a river beneath frozen ice. The sun shifted, casting stripes of light over his hair, illuminating strands that had grown through years I had watched and loved. I traced the curve of his cheek with my eyes, noting how time had etched its quiet patterns, and how love had smoothed some of the rough edges. It struck me then that the sacrifices I had feared were not heavy burdens, but choices made from the heart. To give, to support, to act. These were not weights, but affirmations of trust, of understanding, of the bond we had strengthened in whispers and small gestures. I let my hand hover over his for a long moment, tempted to rest it there but content to simply observe. Every small breath, every quiet movement, seemed amplified in the stillness, teaching me patience, teaching me presence. The decision I had carried, once daunting, now felt inevitable, simple in its clarity. I stood and walked slowly to the window, feeling the cool glass under my fingertips. The city outside stirred gently, lights blinking off one by one as the morning fully arrived. The distant sound of footsteps echoed softly, reminding me that life moved forward, always forward, even as we paused to consider the choices we make. I thought of Leo's journey, of the quiet resilience he had shown, the courage in the silence of his own burdens. And I realized that my choice, my willingness to act, guided by love and truth, was not about erasing fear, but embracing it alongside him. The uncertainty that had haunted me all these days now carried a lesson, that honesty, presence, and care could illuminate even the darkest corners of doubt. I breathed in slowly, filling my lungs with a calm light, and exhaled a release I hadn't known I needed. Returning to the bed, I sat once more beside him, watching the gentle motion of his eyelashes against his cheek. I felt a quiet smile forming on my lips, not forced, not triumphant, but the kind that settles deep in the chest, warming the heart. I picked up the folded forms from the edge of the bed, feeling their weight in my hands, and laid them gently on my lap. Each sheet represented a choice, yes, but also a commitment, a promise to act with care, with awareness, with love. I glanced at his sleeping face again, the subtle movement of his lips, the small flicker of his fingers. It was enough to know that he was here, that we were here, and that the past, with all its secrets and hesitations, had led us to this quiet clarity. I felt a gentle pulse of gratitude, for the trust between us, for the honesty finally shared, for the simple, steady power of connection. The light shifted again, brushing across the floor and onto my own hands. I let them rest lightly, open, accepting the inevitability and grace of the moment. There was no dramatic declaration, no grand fanfare. Only this quiet, steadfast understanding. I could feel the echo of weeks of fear, tension, and confusion dissolving into something lighter, something enduring. Love, honesty, and presence. These were the threads that had guided us, uniting us in ways words could only hint at. I exhaled once more, a long, deliberate breath, and felt my chest settle with an ease I had not anticipated. The mystery of his secret was no longer a burden. It was the revelation of connection, the affirmation that we could meet each other fully, without pretense, without fear. I looked down at him again, noting the faint lift of his lips in sleep, the steady rise of his chest. The hospital walls seemed less imposing now, softened by light, by understanding, by the quiet intimacy of shared humanity. I touched his hand lightly, letting my fingertips rest for a heartbeat, and in that small gesture, I felt the strength that comes from love and truth. It was enough to know that whatever came next, we had met the moment together, and that connection would carry us forward. As I rose, leaving the gentle weight of my hand behind, I felt a deep, grounding peace. Not about sacrifice, not about fear, about the quiet strength of love, honesty, and trust. And as the new day fully arrived, I understood that dawn was not just a beginning of light. It was the awakening of understanding, of clarity, of hearts aligned. The room stayed warm, the sunlight lingering on the sheets. I watched him sleep a moment longer, then turned to leave, each step steady, measured, filled with the certainty that love, truly lived and honestly shared, could carry any burden, mend any gap, and illuminate even the quietest corners of life.